I think I will name her Ruth. And I think that after this lesson, I hope that you'll understand why. So, just to kind of give you guys a background, my class across the hall, we spent 4 weeks going through Ruth. So I'm going to try to condense that into 1 hour. So because of that, I'm not going to be able to cover everything in the greatest detail. But what I want to do is we're going to read through it all, and we'll slow down at the points that are interesting and hopefully appeal to you. So, and anyways, Ruth, Christ as kinsman. So this is one of the, yes, Pat. Are you putting this on tape? I hope so. Let me double check. So we can get it online. Yep, we're recording. Okay. All right, so you'll see me go fast, and I apologize, but hopefully we can get it all here, and we'll upload it on YouTube, and if you guys want to rewatch it or come find me afterwards, please do. All right, so this was my bullet points for how we're going to go through Ruth, but I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff. But some of these still apply. Just like my dad hinted at, there's many levels you can study, 3 or 4. We're going to cover 3 today, but actually at the end, if we have time, we will hit the 4th level of some kind of interesting, you've heard of equidistant letter sequences, right? So we'll hit some of that at the end. But the face value is just the story itself. You can always apply this to yourself personally as well. But what I'm interested in for this class is the prophetic application. For this slide, all I want to say is that Ruth is one of the best books to tie together some of the New Testament parables, specifically about the agricultural harvests and about the weddings. So I know you guys have heard of them, so when we get there, I'll slow down and we'll read them, and that'll kind of give us a new lens to look at Ruth with. And of course, I like to take a moment and just say that I don't have many original thoughts. I steal a bunch of information from other people, and I gather it and spout it off. I should put my dad up here because I steal a lot from him. Chuck Missler, I'm sure you guys have heard of. I steal from him as well. For this one, Lynn Mize is a guy. If you Google him online, you'll find he's got a fair bit of thoughts on Ruth. I don't buy all of them, but what it did help me to do when I was preparing is just have an open mind and think about things differently for what it's worth. So just like everything else, take it all with a grain of salt, do your own homework. And then I use lots of good websites like gotquestions.org, HebrewForChristians.com, Bible Gateway, Blue Letter Bible. And if you grew up in the 80s, you would be familiar with LeVar Burton. You don't have to take my word for it. Okay, this is in the time of the Judges. It's the time when Israel begins their cycle of disobedience, punishment, repentance, and on, rinse, repeat. But we're going to skip over that. Oh, okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with Ruth, what I'd like to do is just cover a brief outline of what's going on, and then we'll even cover the brief prophetic implications on who stands for what, so that as we go through it, that'll already be primed, and hopefully you'll see it. And if you don't, feel free to disagree. But the story of Ruth is basically a famine forces Elimelech, Naomi, and her 2 sons, Machlon and Chilion, to move from Bethlehem to Moab. Elimelech dies. The 2 kids marry 2 Gentile women, and then the 2 kids die, and then only the women remain. And then the famine ends, and they get word about it, and they return to Bethlehem, or just Ruth and Naomi. And then Ruth works hard in the field of a guy named Boaz, who's a relative of Elimelech. And Ruth learns from Naomi how to ask Boaz to be her kinsman redeemer, and Boaz accepts, and then pretty soon Ruth and Boaz give birth to David, give birth to Obed, the grandfather of David. So pretty important story. And then in terms of types, I hope you will agree with me as we go through that Naomi is a type of Israel. Ruth and Orpah together are a type of the church. Boaz, being our kinsman redeemer, is a type of Jesus. And the famine is the diaspora. And then as Boaz marries Ruth, redeeming Naomi's land, so too Jesus will marry the church and redeem national Israel and the planet. And there's a lot more. And in fact, the things I'm most excited about aren't even listed here. And even as I prepared to go through this again, trying to condense everything from a month's worth of lessons, I learned even more things. And so I get to share those too. That'll be fun. Okay, drink of water. Ruth 1:1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And if you have seen famine elsewhere in the scripture, it's usually symbolic of either being without the word of God or some sort of punishment. So keep that in mind. So a man from Bethlehem and Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. And went to live is really sojourn, so there was never intended that they stay there. It's just meant to be temporary. And then, Moab has a history with Israel. They're bad guys. They have some pretty terrible paganism, sacrificing children and that sort of thing. Deuteronomy kind of prohibits them from marrying specifically with the Moabites. Verse 2, the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Machlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So Elimelech means my God is king. Naomi means my delight or pleasant. Machlon means unhealthy or sickly. Chilion means pining or wasting. I hope none of you ever name your kids that. Now Elimelech, I already read that. Orpah, sorry, I didn't read that. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Machlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Orpah means the back of the neck, like you're going to turn and flee. Ruth means friendship or desirable. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on a road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them and wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you and your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her, or stuck. She stuck to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So notice Orpah turns her back, like you can imagine seeing the back of her neck as she walks back, and she goes back to her city, her people, and her gods. We are going to cover more of the meaning of this. I'm intentionally withholding for now. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And the significance of the barley harvest, that's Pentecost. Sorry, that's not Pentecost, that's Passover. You guys have been briefed in detail about the holy days. We're going to skip them for now. But just know that Ruth is read during Pentecost. They read the entire book. Pentecost is an interesting holy day of the 7 because it's the only one that uses leavened bread. Most of the other ones, in fact, I think all of them, only used unleavened bread. And why is that? Anybody remember what is leaven a symbol of? Sin. And by extension, the Jews see leaven almost as like a Gentile thing. All right, so personal application. Some Christians, though a part of God's family, do not mature in the faith. They choose to cling to the world and what it values, turning their back and fleeing to it and relying on it for support. Other Christians choose to cling to the Word and live by faith, even though it may require sacrifice. We're going to skip some of the questions in order to get to more of the prophetic application. Okay, so Israel, you could think of it this way. Being full of spiritual pride, rejected Jesus as her Messiah. From the Jewish-Roman wars that followed, specifically in the destruction of the temple on August 10th, 70 AD, Israel was dispersed into the Gentile nations. Their relationship with God had been damaged. But God used this opportunity to graft in the Gentile Christians into his family, the church age, at this time Romans 11, notably through Ephraim and Manasseh. But national support of Israel by Ephraim and Manasseh is dying out, even as Israel returned empty to her land in 1948. Okay, quick pause. So we have the starting point and the end point for the diaspora. If you do the research, you find Josephus makes mention, and also the Jews believe that this is the 9th of Av. I don't know if you guys have studied all the terrible things that happened in Israel on the 9th of Av. But the first temple was destroyed on the same time, and that translates on our calendar to August 10th. They became a land again, or a nation again, on May 14th, 1948, just after World War II. And so you can kind of see the parallels, right? The diaspora, they're kicked out after the destruction of the temple. They are basically spread out to the Gentile world. And this is the perfect time. This is exactly what Paul says happens in Romans 11 about, I think around verse 25, he says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, that Israel has received a hardening in part until the fullness of the Gentiles have come in. And it's meant to bring jealousy about for his people, the Jews, while at the same time grafting in the Gentiles. And so isn't that interesting that we have the Pentecost, leavened bread, paired up with, what Paul is talking about in Romans 11. And then the Ephraim and Manasseh thing. Do you guys remember reading in Genesis 48 how they received a special blessing from Jacob? And he said, let my name be upon them. And then as you guys have studied in this class, you can trace back the people groups of Ephraim and Manasseh to Great Britain and the United States. And the reason, so this is an original thought. Look at it with scrutiny. If you disagree, that's totally fine, but I'm trying to kind of throw something out there and see what sticks. But it seems to me that these two people groups have been a huge blessing to the world, have they not? And not only that, but we've been kind of the most recognized Christian nations in the world, have we not? And so what's happening in the story is that, the way I read it in Ruth, is that Machlon and Kilion are basically representations of those nations that acquire their Gentile brides, and that's the church. Like the church is predominantly known in these countries, or what we now know as these countries. But if you trace back the people groups, they could be traced to, I think, Ephraim and Manasseh. All right, let's keep going. Oh, we got to pause. Parable of the sower and parable of the weeds. So for chapter 2, there's a lot of agricultural references. This is when Ruth is going to go glean in the fields of Boaz. So what occurred to me as I was reading, and this is what Len Mize helped me to do, is to think about the parables and try to overlay those parables with the story of Ruth. So I'm gonna jump out really quick because I didn't feel like copying and pasting this into my slides. Let's go read the parable of the sower for being a refresher. Can you guys see that? Okay. Yay, that's huge. All right, parable of the sower. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while the people stood on the shore. Excuse me. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on the good soil, where it produced a crop 160 to 30 times it was sown. Whoever has ears, let him hear. And the disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? And he replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become callous. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. So this lines perfectly with what Paul says in Romans 11. This is their hardening, right? They're not going to get it. Jesus spoke to them in parables. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and long to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they fall quickly away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. Okay, so gives the parable, gives the meaning. We have the same thing, a lot shorter, and I think this is even more important, is the parable of the weeds as it relates to Ruth. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed a good seed in his field, but while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." And then we'll scroll down. He explains it further. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let him hear." Okay, so I hope that primes you, because he just gave many of the characters that if we were going to look at Ruth and see this prophetically, you're going to see a lot of those same characters and the same things show up. Okay, so we'll go back to the slides.
Daniel.
Yep.
What thing occurs to me there is God is taking out the weeds first, rather than the saints leaving the world first. So you have a comment about that?
Yeah. Let's hit pause on it, and then if I don't answer it, let's talk after. But good point. Yep. That actually goes along with Revelation 14, so we'll get there. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And this guy owned a lot of land, and he was wealthy. And he was, if you take the Hebrew characters that make up his name, and you break them apart, so you're not going to find this if you go look it up in Blue Letter Bible, but if you break them apart, you'll see that his name is like Mighty Fierce Warrior, which is appropriate, I think, if he's going to be playing the part of Jesus. All right, so, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." So this is how Israel took care of their own, of the poor and the destitute. They didn't have any systematic way of caring for the poor like we do today, but what they did was, as the harvesters went through the field to harvest, they were not allowed to go back a second time. They'd made one pass. Whatever they didn't get was left for the poor, and that's basically what Ruth is going to go do. If you grew up in a technology area like me and you have no, like when they make agricultural references, it goes right over my head. I had to kind of look up what each of these mean, so I'll go over them in a sec. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. All right, who are the harvesters? We just got through reading. They're the angels, maybe. That's what I submit to you. Keep that in mind. All right, so threshing, winnowing, and harvest and sifting are basically just progressively more detailed ways of getting the edible stuff from the plant, right? So they first take it in threshing and they beat it against the ground or against something hard, and it'll make the first level of separation. It'll break apart the the grain, which has still got the chaff on it from the stalk and the husk. And then winnowing, you can see them doing here. You find a place with a lot of wind. You take that pile, you throw it up in the air, and then the bad stuff, the wind will tend to carry further downwind, slightly ahead of the good stuff, which tends to fall straight down. And that's after that. Sorry, they have to kind of beat it first, like get animals to walk over it or stomp on it. And then sifting is one level deeper. They'll take the first pile that has the good stuff, and it's still got other impurities. And then they have this way of taking a sieve, and they'll kind of toss it up like this while they blow, and that'll bring up the bad stuff, and it'll make it to where when they blow, it goes away. So it's just kind of a further filtering. And so remember when, have you ever wondered what was meant when Jesus told Peter that Satan is asked to sift you like wheat? I never understood that until I studied this. Because when they take that sieve and they do this, like beforehand, you've got this pile, and it's not clear, like all the bad stuff that's there. You just kind of see this homogeneous pile of mostly good stuff, but there's still bad stuff in there. So when they sift, it brings the bad stuff up. I'll try to talk over it. And so maybe what Jesus was saying is that Satan is going to try to bring out the bad stuff in you, but I've prayed for you so that your faith might not fail. Right? So just for what it's worth. All right. So what do each of those mean? Threshing, winnowing, and sifting. And if you kind of examine, and also the chaff. Chaff is pretty easy because you can see references of that. That's another sin reference, right? Nobody wants to eat chaff. You wouldn't be able to. And so what they do is it's a good fuel. So they tend to burn it so that animals don't try to get in and get some of the leftovers or anything else. And then you remember Jesus saying, making constant references to agriculture. He's going to send out us into the field to work the field. And so what is this thing that we're doing? We're taking the chaff in the stalks of grain that have, that are ripe for harvest, and we're trying to separate the good stuff from the bad stuff. And that's more or less our jobs while we're out there, right? And so Jesus said, my food is to do the will of the one who sent me and to finish his work. That could be, think about Ruth being in the field, and she's helping prepare this grain to be eaten, or some of it to be replanted. And that's kind of going back to the parable of the sower. Either we're going to be spreading the word and replanting, or you're going to make something edible and refreshing to somebody else. But if the food that eventually becomes is like analogous to Jesus saying that that's my food, it's to do the will of the one who sent me, then maybe this is referring to harvesting righteousness, basically, separating the bad from the good in our own lives and the lives of our close loved ones, and doing the good works that God has prepared in advance for us to do, right? But keeping the other analogies in mind, like when Paul says that there's basically seed spreaders, seed waterers, but only God is the one that makes it grow. I'm skipping around a lot. But what is it that the angels are responsible for doing? They're harvesting, right? So let's keep reading. We're going to get into that more. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. And you can almost imagine prophetically, in any given workday, this could be Jesus telling the angels, "Hey, good morning." And the angels saying back, "The Lord bless you. The Lord be with you." And then Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." All right, so if the harvesters are the angels, then who is the overseer of the harvesters that is not Jesus? God, maybe? I tend to see this as the Holy Spirit, because the analogous thing that happens to Abraham when Isaac is going to seek a son, he sends out an unnamed servant to bring them together, right? And so typically you see the Holy Spirit being in prophecy as this unnamed person. And we never get the name of the overseer of the harvesters. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And also note, Ruth asked. She asked to go and glean. Nobody came up to her and said, "Hey, Ruth, why don't you come over here and glean in our field?" So there is some responsibility on Ruth's part to come and join in the process. So you can almost see it as, maybe in a sense, Jesus talking to the Holy Spirit in the heavenlies. "Hey, who's that person down there? That's Marilyn, or that's Carl, or that's Pat, or whoever," right? So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Okay. So maybe Jesus wants us to stay working in his field. We'll hit that again later. At this, she bowed down her face to the ground, and she asked, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you've noticed me, a foreigner?" Translation, like maybe from our part. Why has God given us grace? We're Gentiles. We're not Jews. The Jews are God's oracle people. Why did God look on us and give us mercy? "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." So the Jews, they have in God's economy, they're pretty high up on the totem pole, right? So why is it that we've been brought in? Just by the grace of God. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and have come to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Who is the best friend of Israel in the Jewish people? Who helps take care of them in a sense? That's the church, right? Who sticks up for them, like especially at least maybe better beforehand compared to now, but the United States has been a huge friend to Israel, right? So maybe this is coming out as part of the story. And then under whose wings you've come to take refuge. Refuge here is chasa, and it means to flee for refuge. And I got a link here kind of describing where I got it from, but think of that as a rabbit might seek protection in the cleft of a rock from pursuing wolves. So as we work this field, maybe we have enemies that are trying to get us, and we have a hedge of protection over the farmland, so long as we stay within that hedge of protection. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When he sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted, and she had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." How crazy is that to think that Jesus and the overseer, right, the Holy Spirit, are talking to the angels about orchestrating events in our lives to help us to do the work that we've been called to do. I never put that together until this time around. But how about that? I mean, you always wonder, to what extent does God work directly in our lives versus delegate to angels? Maybe it's both, and certainly we see that in the story, but you can just kind of see it prophetically, like, God, Yahweh, is in control of everything. But Jesus, according to Colossians, right, he is the one that is the implementer of what God wants to do. He is the firstborn over all creation. He made this place like himself on God's command. And then Jesus talking with the Holy Spirit, who oversees the angels, and then all that to kind of help orchestrate our work here while we're here working the field. So if you can buy that. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah, which is about 30 pounds, a lot of food. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." And
Interesting, kindness to the living and the dead.
yeah, what's your thought?
Well, the thought is, of course, Boaz is a shadow of the type of Christ. And
Oh,
he showed
yes.
kindness to the living and the dead. Isn't this curious? Why? I don't
Oh, that's good. So I think if I had to guess in the story, she's maybe making reference to Elimelech and the former family that was there, but no, I didn't see that. Prophetically, that might be an allusion to how when Christ died, he died not just for the people that were alive then and going forward. He died for everybody at that point and going backward that were already gone.
In fact, he went and broke people out of the chains in Sheol.
Oh, that's right.
He spent some time down there.
According to Jude.
So this is, the more you look at it, the deeper it gets.
Yeah. Well, Guardian Redeemer next week, and that week is now, this minute. So, then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finished harvesting all my grain.' Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.' So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law." A couple of different points. Do you think it was an accident that Ruth ended up working in the field of Boaz, who happened to be a relative of Elimelech, that makes all this possible? And so I think that gives me comfort to know that I didn't come and discover Jesus by accident. I mean, from the outside looking in, it all looks like an accident. But I don't believe that for a second, that God was not in control and somehow caused all that to happen. The other thing, in someone else's field you might be harmed. We kind of talked about that for a sec. Have you ever known a loved one to try to wander outside of the field? And then what happens? They get picked off and they get attacked. And it's because they are forfeiting their hedge of protection. You can go read about that more in Isaiah 5. But it's another agricultural reference, right? You put a hedge around the garden to keep the animals out from eating it up. So if a little kernel of wheat happens to fall outside the fence, that just makes it easy to eat. And then, so this is one of my favorite parts that I discovered. Why does it mention this little sentence that if you've ever read Ruth, you read right over it and don't give it a second thought. But they make specific mention of the fact that they glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished.
There's two harvests here.
They go through.
Who is the barley? Who is the wheat?
What do you think? Well, let's hear them.
Well, that's Israel and the church.
I think that's right.
And there's evidence of it. There's evidence of it in Matthew 24.
Yeah.
And so it speaks about a gathering of Israel. But that gathering takes place after the church is renewed. So the analogies there, the more you look, the deeper it gets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's dig deeper into the barley and wheat harvest. I don't remember why I put this slide in. Probably just for a refresher for when we had it from the weeks before. All right, personal application. A Christian that is growing in spiritual maturity should discover their job and participate in the work of harvesting righteousness for themselves and their loved ones. So you can imagine there's a lot that goes into farming. You can be the waterer, you can be the fertilizer, you can be the, I don't know, name your job. But everything is different. They all go into making the harvest successful. So I think the analogy for us, what is our job in working the field, and are we doing it, or are we taking a short rest? You heard from the story that Ruth worked diligently, and she took only a short rest, but she was out there working the fields for herself and for Naomi. All right, prophetically, Jesus may be watching his bride work the field at the end of the age right now. If so, this should create a sense of urgency for the church because the threshing and separation may be just around the corner. Yep. And then, what was I going to say? Yeah, just, the parable of the weeds really helped me to kind of nail down, like, Jesus is directing the angels, and the angels are doing, this is one point I wanted to make sure we talked about. I think it's the primary job of the angels to separate the wheat from the weeds, right? Ruth's primary job was in the separating of the chaff, right? She didn't really have to worry about the weeds too much. So I think the analogy, perhaps for us, is we don't have to worry about judging people's eternal state, right? Because some people in this world are weeds, and some of us, hopefully us, are the wheat, the ones that are going to be harvested. So I think the application on our side is that let it be to God, to the angels, to Jesus, to do that separating of the righteous from the wicked. I think for us, it's more about focusing on getting rid of the chaff in our lives, getting rid of the things that are not the wheat kernel, the thing that goes into making bread. Right? All right, so here's what's interesting about why they mention the wheat and the barley harvest. That gives us a time frame. At the very beginning of chapter 1, they say that it was about 10 years that they were sojourning to Moab, right? So about 10 years to me means closer to 10 than most other numbers. I'm going to pop out. We're going to do some algebra. All right, so if this is indeed true, that the sojourn into Moab is a type of the diaspora, then and we know the time for the diaspora, right? That's more or less ended because it started on AD 70 at the destruction of the temple, perhaps, and they came back on May 14th, 1948. So we have that block of time that can help us map onto what's going on in the story. And they tell us it's about 10 years. Well, for me, I think a reasonable number to choose to represent 10 years, like the lowest it could be and still be about 10, in my opinion, is 9.5. So let's just give that a number to work with. So we have the diaspora. Let's calculate the number of days between August 10th, 70 AD and May 14th, 1948. We can do this online really easily. There are date calculators online everywhere. And so you can punch in the numbers, you can get the, what is this? 8, 10, 70 to 5, 14, 1948. And it gives us some numbers. There are 685,839 days, right? And I'm not going to do this with every one of them, but I've done them ahead of time. You get that number of days for the diaspora, and then the number of days between 1948, when they became the nation again, and now. Like their land is not yet redeemed. They're still fighting for it. So you can almost imagine that is the time Ruth is in the field working the harvest, kind of like what we're doing right now, right? So between, I don't know, May 14th, 1948 and September 21st of 2017. It's just picking a random date. And that ends up being 25,332, right? So we get this ratio that's just, one number compared to another. We can use that to kind of and look back at the story and ask ourselves, does this make sense given what Ruth is saying? Does this fit the story? If are we at the end of the age? Are we about to be done with the harvest, in a sense, today? And as it turns out, it does. The harvest time, I looked up everywhere I could find it. It doesn't nail it down explicitly, but the barley and wheat harvest is about a 4-month period. And if you're using a prophetic calendar, which we tend to do when we're doing these types of things in prophecy, we use 360-day years and 30-day months. If we do that, then if the sojourn in Ruth is about 10 years, like 9.5 months, 9.5 months, times 360-day years, you get a number, and use that to backtrack and find out how long was the harvest. Does it make sense? Is it close to 120 days? And it is. It's 126 days. So this is a work in progress. I don't know what that extra leftover means. It just means we haven't quite nailed it down. Maybe we're missing something here and there. But this is the first time that I've gone into it at this level of detail. So if you see something that needs to be adjusted, or you can think of something more...
kind of tie that all together with
Yep.
of the time they were in what was the country?
Moab.
Moab.
Yep.
The time they were in Moab is a certain ratio of the time of a person's life, right? Is that what you're looking at?
Nope. In the story, we're told that she works the field. They're in their land, but the land is not yet redeemed
Yeah.
for the barley and the wheat harvest. So that's some amount of time. It almost doesn't matter for this illustration. And it says that it was about 10 years that they were outside of the land, like in the diaspora, like exiled, right? Not exiled, but they had to leave because there was no food.
Yeah.
So they were gone for 10. They came back and worked the field for 4 months. And so what we're doing is we're using that ratio and seeing how it lines up with if this is a representation of today.
Okay, so you're comparing the ratio of time.
Yes.
And the ratios seem to
Very, very, very close. But as time goes on, that drifts a little bit more to where it's less meaningful. It gets more out of whack. So what this tells me is that we're right at the end and time is running out for this to no longer make sense. The more time goes on, the less this makes sense, right? So yeah, diaspora, 10 years. Working in or sojourning into Moab, 10 years. 1948, the time between that and 70 is 1,878 years. They worked it for a third of the year is their harvest time. That is almost exactly the time between they get back into their land in 1948 to now. Does that make sense?
So the ratio is really close, and as you point out, it's getting worse. Eventually the ratio will make no sense.
Exactly.
So the point being,
we're in overtime.
We're on overtime.
And what I think, to me, when I see this being slightly off, could be an indication of God's grace, because He doesn't want to lose people. He's trying to probably keep this together to get more people into the kingdom to complete the fullness of the Gentiles.
Now, you have heard me say that we're at least a year overdue, because I believe, based on the evidence, we should have been out of here. But Rosh Hashanah was delayed 2 days, miraculously. It would be interesting to put that number up, that, instead of 2017, how about 2015? That would almost be right on the nose. And now you can argue we've got 2 years here that things have been extended for 2 years.
Yep. It's pretty close. I think I ran the numbers and it was 2014, 2015, somewhere around there. But we're at 9.5 and 120 was even. So I guess the point is there is no doubt in my mind that that is significant. And there's no doubt in my mind that God intentionally wanted that little snippet to be in there about the harvest. Like, why else was that important?
Why else put that information in there?
Right.
Just
He's waiting for the last Gentile to make it in. Yep.
it's over with.
Yep. All right, I've got 11 minutes left until the end of the hour, so I'm going to try to really go fast, but that was one of the most exciting things that I've discovered in the last 6 months. Yeah, let's try to get to the end. All right, this is chapter 3. One day Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." Excuse me. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes, then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Go uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Very interesting, those 4 things that she was told to do. Wash. We see that in Ephesians 5. Wash yourself with the word. Put on perfume, i.e. anoint. If you look in the King James, it's really the word anoint. We've seen that in 1 John 2. We received an anointing of the Holy Spirit. And put on your best clothes. You guys probably covered that in Revelation 19. But it's also elsewhere. This is almost always indicative of fine linen. That it represents the works of the saints. The righteousness works of the saints. Yep, so it's essentially do your good works that you've been assigned to do. And then go, there's always going to be some commitment on some action that it represents a commitment on your part. So I think that's what makes a lot of sense. And I didn't make all that up. I saw a lot of other commentators thinking similar things. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned, and there was a woman laying at his feet. He's probably cold. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. So spreading the corner of your garment was a way of saying, you need to marry me. And we could go through like the significance of the hem or the edge of your garment. I think Carl has probably covered this before, the talit and the zitzit, and the significance of the woman that wants to grab onto Jesus, the edge of his cloak. And the only thing I want to tack onto that is that it was very interesting, and I didn't notice until Chuck brought it up, that as he's going to heal this little girl of 12 years old that was dead, and he wanted to resurrect her, or was she sick? I think she's already dead, right? It's the same story. On his way to doing that was when the woman that had been dealing with blood for 12 years, that all happened at the same time. But do you see the significance? The girl was 12 years old. She had been dealing with blood for 12 years. And the very fact that she was around Jesus while she was dealing with that is a huge clue that she was not Jewish. They were not allowed to be around people in that time. They were meant to go away, right, until that finished. So she was a Gentile woman who had the faith to grab onto Jesus as he's on his way to heal a Jewish girl. So how crazy is that you get almost the same story here as well? All right. Then we get the Guardian Redeemer story. All of the requirements are lined out in Deuteronomy 25. But it's exactly what you think. I'm not going to read it because we're trying to make this go fast. But basically, if you had a brother and that brother's, if the husband of a woman dies and that husband had a brother, it was his duty in Jewish culture to take her as a wife. And the point was that God assigned all these guys their land, and he wanted it to stay with them. That was a part of their inheritance, right? And so that was a way to continue the family line. All right, so when Ruth asks Boaz to do this, it's a genius move because it solves three problems. It provides the rest, protection, and care for Ruth that Naomi was originally trying to provide for her. It redeems Naomi's land because as kinsman redeemer, Elimelech's land and that line, they get everything back the way it was before. And it continues on Elimelech himself, like his lineage, right? And do you see the parallels of what's going on? Oh man, this is really exciting. I don't know if I'm going to have time. But what is being redeemed in Revelation chapter 5? We have this document that has 7 scrolls, is written on both sides, the front and the back, and he goes through breaking the seals, but only Jesus is qualified to open it. And so why is that interesting? And what's being redeemed? Well, we know that the earth we lost the title deed to the earth, mankind, because we sinned. And that was handed over basically to Satan. Jesus does not dispute Satan when he is tempting Jesus and says, I'll give you the kingdoms back. Why was that a temptation? It's because Jesus, if his mission, you could argue, is twofold. He came here to redeem the land and to take the bride. In order to redeem the bride, he had to die. And so Satan was basically saying, you don't have to go to the cross. I'll just give you the property back. It's okay. So that's why it was a genuine temptation for Jesus to have that put in front of him. We see precedent for this in Jeremiah 32. They're about to go into exile under Babylon, and God tells Jeremiah to buy his uncle's field, and you see the exact same thing play out. You've got 2 scrolls, one sealed, one open, more or less, and it was written on both sides, and it's just to show you that's a title deed. And then Ruth, chapter 3, in the same way that Boaz is going to make this redemption happen, it's really tying together all of those stories at once. Does that make sense? And so then we get to Matthew 25 and 22, and I think we only have 5 minutes left. I'll just have to paraphrase. This is what we covered the last time I spoke, where I had like 2 minutes at the end of class, and I tried to rush through it. The parable of the wedding banquet and the parable of the 10, the foolish and wise virgins. That's you have to look at that in light of Ruth. That it's really a complement to those parables. They both complement each other. So in those stories, you'll notice that. I'll just try to pop out really quick.
Take an extra 2. Go ahead.
Since we're recording, what I could do is go over a little bit late. If you need to run, go ahead and run. But that way, I don't have to come back next week and try to rehash everything that we may have forgotten. And I'll post the rest online. So if I go late, I'm sorry. Here it is. Oops. Sorry. All right, Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fatted cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing any clothes, and he asked, 'How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'" So we went through it fast, but the most interesting part of the story is that the bride is never mentioned. And why is that? It's because the parables that begin in Matthew 21 and go to 25 or 26 are a response to the chief priests and elders of the law. This is when Jesus had been brought into the city to be inspected for flaws, as the Passover lamb was brought in to be inspected for flaws. It was the same time as Nisan 10, right? So he's not telling a Gentile story, he's telling a Jewish story. And the story is that the son is going to be married, and the Jewish people, in a sense, are invited. But the bride is never mentioned. And it's because, like Paul says in Ephesians 5, and like we're seeing through Ruth, it's a Gentile bride. And what's not mentioned in the story here, what we learn from Ruth is that it's not just any arrangement. It's a kinsman redeemer wedding, and there's a lot more going on than just at face value, right? So you can kind of study this slide if you want, and you can see my attempts at trying to name out the other participants in the story. I think the servants are interesting because God almost always identifies the prophets as the servants. So you can imagine God sending his servants to Israel in different phases over history, and at some point he gets ticked off at them and he burns their city. And to me, that's the diaspora. The next time he's sending prophets to them, I think, is when the 144,000 are here after the church is gone. And that's the time when everybody's going to be invited, in a sense. All right. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took out their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. So, I'm not going to read all this one. This one is more complimentary than the rest of them because it's trying to identify the other parts of the wedding that are going on, right? This is more about the bridesmaids of the wedding and the journey of the bridegroom and the bride as they exit the chuppah and they go to the wedding party, and they're going to pick up the bridesmaids along the way, and that might be a reference to, those guys, the invited guests. Yep.
This really ties together a lot that we could spend a whole
You
hour
could-
on this one.
Exactly.
one word.
And that's what I did. That's why I had slides. That was from another lesson where we spent the entire hour going over it. So I'm just trying to kind of more or less just bring it up, let you see that it's something to go study, and know that that ties into Ruth. Keep it all in the kind of the same context. All right, the Lord bless you, my daughter. He replied, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town will know you're a woman of noble character. Although it is true I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there's another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, surely as the Lord lives, I'll do it. Lie here until morning. So, and the way I read it, who would be closer to redeem us than Jesus? It would be like, in my opinion, if you had a man who was not God, like not any part of him God, but somehow was able to live a perfect life. He would be able to open the scroll in Revelation 5. He would be qualified. But nobody, aside from Jesus, has ever been able to or will ever be able to. So that's, to me, that's kind of what I see in the story. There is somebody there, but you're going to see he's not going to be able to do it. So she laid his feet till morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized and said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he or she went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how'd it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. So a lot of people think that's a code, that 6 measures of barley is a way of saying, I'm not going to stop, I'm not going to rest. Rest is like the 7th, right? The 6-7 pattern. All right, prophetic application. At the end of the church age, after the harvest is complete, Jesus will marry the church, redeeming the land of Israel and the planet. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, come over here, my friend, sit down. So he went over and sat down. And that's probably where town transactions took place, at the gate. Meanwhile, let's skip over that. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative, Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. And you can go through all of Leviticus 25 about the various redemptions. You've got the slaves, the land, brother's wife. It's all tied in together. When Jesus comes to be set up as the ruler of the millennium, all these are basically going to start making a lot more sense. And he says, I will redeem it. Oops. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the deed of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off a sandal and gave it to another. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Oops. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilkion, and Machlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Machlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. And it's very interesting that word bought, acquired. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite. That's not the word acquired, that is the word purchased. Boaz purchased Ruth to be his wife. And that's important because you see all the references in the New Testament about Jesus, purchasing us. We are the purchased bride. And it falls right in line. So Corinthians 6 and 7, but also Revelation chapter 5. It says, because you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased us for God. Persons from every tribe, language, and people and nation. Right? We talked about all that. Yes. So this is one of the things that I think is very important that most commentators that I have studied don't see. Most of them will try to only equate Ruth with the church. But it's Ruth and Orpah together, I think. And this is one of the things Len Mize, I got from him. Imagine this happens and it's all said and done. What do you think would happen when word gets back to Moab, to Orpah, that they're taken care of? Not only taken care of, but they are in a wealthy family where Ruth is the wife. Do you think that she would want to come join? And if she did, what would happen? She would make her trek. She would get to the land. She would potentially be able to work on that property and maybe be as close as family, but she's not going to be co-owner with Boaz in the field and the property, right? So to me, when we're out of here in the rapture, we are identified as the bride. We will marry Jesus in a sense. For those that have not figured it out, have not matured in the faith, they're going to be like Orpah. It's not like their eternal destiny is in question, but their role when they finally make it over to the right field in the right city is going to be far different from Ruth's, perhaps.
She's been redeemed.
Yeah.
And this is perfectly consistent with our understanding in Revelations, where that massive number
Yes.
that is seen in the heavenlies, and the angel tells John, these are those who have come out of great tribulation.
Yep.
And their role is to serve in the temple. Their role is not kings and priests.
Mm-hmm.
So you got pretty much a one-to-one here.
Yep. It's interesting to note, this is from Chuck, every time Ruth is mentioned throughout the book, or throughout her book by her name, her social progression increases. At first, she's known as a foreigner from chapter 2, and it's very interesting if you do a word study on foreigner. You could also translate that as disaster. Then she's identified as a lower level servant, and finally a servant who is eligible for marriage, and then a wife. So that's kind of like us, right? Before we know God, we're a disaster. And then we kind of make our progression, and eventually we're going to be the wife of Jesus. All right, so then the elders and all the people at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord take this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. And that is a mature audience's only story at Genesis 38. Don't read it to your kids if you've got small ones.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting that that's mentioned because if you remember the story, Perez is one of the twins who is illegitimate born of Judah and Tamar, right?
Yep.
And what do we know about, well, we'll get there in a sec. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and then she made love to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian and redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. And of course he does. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. And it's also interesting to remember that Boaz's mom was Rahab the prostitute. Boaz had a Gentile mom. All right, then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him, and the women living there said, Naomi has a son. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then we get the genealogies. And it's interesting because if you look at Deuteronomy 23, anyone born of an illegitimate birth, they're not to enter the assembly of the Lord for 10 generations. How many generations here between Perez, the illegitimate guy, and David? Can you guess? 10. All right, so here we go. Here's the last part of our lesson today. Genesis 38, the one that was referenced that you're not supposed to read to your kids, that tells the story of Tamar and Judah. would you believe that this has equidistant letter sequences built in that give the names of the major characters in the story of Ruth in chronological order and of the same skip sequence, or the same skip distance? So what I mean by that is, in 49 letter intervals, you first see the name of Boaz, and then a little bit later, so remember it's reading right to left, so you'll see Boaz first and then Ruth. Then you'll see later on Obed, and then Jesse, and then David. Boaz, Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David. And you have to remember that not only is that interesting because it's there at all, but that was written generations before Ruth was ever penned, right? This is in Genesis. This is the first book of Moses. Yeah. Yep.
And there was an equidistant letter sequence there, which, how do you explain? It's inexplicable unless there was a divine intelligence monitoring this whole construction.
Right.
And so to those who would say that equidistant letter sequences don't mean anything, now they do. They demonstrate that God had a plan from the very beginning and that he was in control of the writing of the text. And that's why the Jews, when they copied it, were under such strict requirements so that they made no error at all. And if they made an error in copy, they had to burn the whole thing.
Yep.
And that's why we have the Torah today in such pristine condition. Okay.
Well, that was it. Go ahead. Do you guys have questions, thoughts?
Just Ken, I was curious.
Yeah. So Ken asked the question earlier. He noticed the order of the reaping was that we first get rid of the weeds, and then we gather the wheat, or the good stuff.
If that's referring to Israel, Israel in Matthew 24 is gathered by the angels at the sound of the great trumpet.
Yep.
And so the destruction of the wicked, the grapes of wrath, occurred just before that, or concurrently with it. I'm not sure. I'm going to have to go read that again myself. But there is an argument to be made that the trampling of that winepress occurs before the gathering of Israel back to Jerusalem.
Yep. I think I want to say that the same thought occurred to me, but I didn't have an answer. And the reason why is because when you consider the end of Revelation 14, like here, the evil people are equated with the grapes, right? But in this first paragraph, it's a little bit ambiguous, but because they specifically mention grapes here and they don't here, it makes you think that it's wheat. And that lines up with Matthew 13. So either that's a separate event, or you could think of it as they're gathered. It's just the gathering, right? They actually haven't been thrown into the barn yet.
You made a good point, because the first one talks about a harvest.
Yep.
And then it says another angel came with another sharp
Right.
sickle. So it's implied that there has been a harvest, but it's not defined as to what the harvest is. And the assumption that it's wheat could very well be.
Yep. There's a lot of different thoughts on the different harvests and how they relate to end time events.
And I didn't see that before.
Yeah. And one of the things my dad and I discussed yesterday was this fact in here. It says that I looked there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man. And then the angel asked him to do the reaping and harvesting. I found other precedent for other angels in the Old Testament as being equated to Jesus. You look we talked about Ephraim and Manasseh at the very beginning in Genesis 48. He makes reference to an angel that has redeemed or protected him, and he wants that same angelic protection on Ephraim and Manasseh. And the word angel, if you look in your NIV, is capitalized. And I was like, why is it capitalized? And it's because that's one of the times they think that an angel is referenced, but it's really Jesus in disguise. Same thing with Jericho, the mighty warrior, and some others. So there's a lot.
It's the Hebrew word Elohim.
No, in this case it was Malach. It was a different word.
Was it?
Yeah.
I was going to say it was Elohim. I got an answer to that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's got some answers. So, I'm very grateful that you guys have allowed me to come in here and spew out just kind of a nonstop stream of words for the last hour and almost 15 minutes. There's a lot going on. Please come find me. I like questions because I don't by any means think that this is all correct. But I know that just by getting it out there and by getting everybody's mind stimulated, we can kind of iron sharpen iron away and figure it out. So,
You're gonna post this.
and I'm going to post it. I'm going to go ahead and kick off the recording now. So if you guys know anybody that cares, feel free to forward it on.